let's say if you were in France and you wanted to journey to the Holy Land, the way was going to be long and hazardous. So you would go to the local Knights Templar, and you would get a chit, or a little coated piece of paper, and you'd deposit money with them. And then along the way, you could stop at any temple of the Knights or headquarters, and they would give you money to continue on your way. And then when you came back, they would reconcile it all. And if you had overpaid, they'd repay you. And if you had underpaid, then they charged you to make up the difference.
And yet, as you mentioned, along the way, they lose the protection of the church bodies, their patron saints, if you will, at the top, who had been looking out after them, who had been making sure that they remained in power in their own right, and they get, either murdered or they go underground.
Well, they found themselves in a position of going into competition with the Roman Church, not in the area of religion, but in the area of power and finance. The Church had been loaning money to kings and queens and to countries, and pretty soon the Knights Templar were there too. And so I think you can see where that animosity got started.
Sure, and so they flee. And as you already mentioned, there is a contingent that seeks refuge in Scotland, in Great Britain, and it's there that in that area the Freemasonry movement is born. But there's also this other ship, and I just absolutely love this. I hope this is true. That there is a strong possibility that they went and discovered or landed on, maybe not spending much time there, but landed on and spent some time in the New World. Can you give us a little more on that?
Right. We're taught in school that America was named after an Italian discoverer named Amerigo Vespucci. Well, it's simply not true. So much of what we think is true, that's not true. The reason that story came about was because a German monk named Walsemuller, who never got more than a few miles from his home on the French and German border, in the early 1500s, though, had access to a printing press. And he knew they had found a new world over here, and he knew that it was called America, and he also had heard of Amerigo Vespucci, so he just put two and two together and published a book that said, well, America was named after Amerigo Vespucci. Walsemuller himself came and retracted this assertion, but of course by then it was too late. It was in print, and if it's in print, then we all know it's got to be true. And what actually happened was that the Knights Templar, when they dug up these scrolls in Jerusalem, apparently came across some of the work of an older cult called the Mandeans, that were connected to the Essenes. And they had the idea, along with the Essenes, that when you died, you could go to a land of milk and honey far across the country, far across the ocean, that they called America. So the Knights Templar, when they were forced underground and their great fleet full of treasure left the French port of La Rochelle, the idea is that they came to L'America, okay? And there is some evidence to back that up because, for example, in Westford, Massachusetts, today there is an ancient engraving of a knight on a rock, and he was dressed in the proper thing, and he carried a picture, a shield with a picture of a sailing ship following this star, which was, again, connects back to the Mandean idea that this star would carry you westward to L'America. And this figure also has the style
shield
of the Knights Templar.
Right, the shield is what and that's so interesting. And I remember as a boy reading a copy of Yankee magazine, and my parents had this, and there was an article in there then about this mystery they've never been able to resolve. They know the age of that drawing, that engraving on the rock had to have been at least 100 years before Christopher Columbus, but they had never been able to explain how the Indians or somebody had carved an image of a Western knight on a rock before Christopher Columbus had come anywhere near the continent. And I think that is one less than ancient mystery solved in the book Rule by Secrecy. Jim Marrs, the author, will start taking your questions coming up. Join in the conversation, if you will, after the top of the hour news. My name's Ian Punnett, and this is Coast to Coast AM. Had a chance to either fill in or host my own episodes of Coast to Coast AM. Jim Marrs has been part of the Coast to Coast family. And even though he has retired from the program, Art Bell, of course, will always be the heart and soul of the show and an ongoing member of the Coast to Coast AM family as well. And so when there's a loss in Art Bell's family, it is a loss to all of us, and I know to many of you that are listening. So it is that I bring you the sad news to start this hour that was just given to me, that tonight Art Bell Sr. has passed on in Tampa, Florida. He has been suffering, as many of you know, for many years with cancer, but died of heart failure at about 8 p.m. Eastern this evening. Art Bell Sr. Having had a profound influence on Art Bell Jr., and I know that your thoughts and prayers are with Art at this difficult time, Art and his whole family. Condolences could be sent, if you would, to artbell@mindspring.com. And although we know that a long, prolonged illness brings some peace in this kind of resolution, it must not be any easier for Art Bell Jr. to begin this new phase of his life with such sad news. And I thank you all for your patience on that. I just felt like that has to be said before we can go back to the fun of the book of Rule by Secrecy with Jim Marrs. Coming up in just a second, we'll give you the phone numbers again. And thank you for passing along your thoughts to Art. I'm sure he would be glad to hear from you. And whatever secret society it is that you've always been curious about, Jim Marrs has addressed it in the book Rule by Secrecy, a virtual encyclopedia, as we have referred to it, in the collection of information about not just secret societies, but also the effect that secret societies have had upon history. Many of these events, especially in regard to, say, Nazi Germany, have not been discussed in any other forum that I have ever seen. Many discussions about the occult and Hitler, but not necessarily secret societies or the effect of secret societies on the Civil War in this country, the American Revolution, World War I, as well as World War II, the Korean War, and all the way up to the assassination of JFK and beyond. All of these areas are open for your questions with Jim Marrs coming up next. My name's Ian Punnett, and this is Coast to Coast AM. Announcement came as a direct result of a secret society, by the way. My name is Ian Punnett, and welcome to my one-night-a-week contribution to the new Coast to Coast AM every Sunday night into Monday morning. And Jim Marrs, being my first guest, couldn't think of a better book to begin with, as I have long since been fascinated with the truth behind secret societies. And we'll open up the phones here, and we'll start getting people that'll join us in just a few moments, Jim. But let me just pick up a little bit of where we were before the top of the hour, as we have come, in effect, now to America, courtesy of the Knights Templar. Of course, it'll be a while before secret societies are established in the North American continent. But can you address quickly how much of Freemasonry do you think was involved in the American Revolution, and how much of it was just strictly the way that we perceive it in the mainstream history books?
Well, it makes a much greater impact than we've ever been taught. For example, in a 1782 letter, our first president, George Washington, wrote, It was not my intention to doubt that the doctrines of the Illuminati had not spread in the United States. On the contrary, no one is more fully satisfied of this fact than I am. So the secret societies, the Illuminati, which were banned in Germany and then rolled into a group called the Order of Strict Observance, which became part of the inner movement of Freemasonry. And they actually helped establish the United States, the men that participated in the Boston Tea Party. By several reports from Masonic sources, started off that evening in their Masonic hall. So there's no real question about that. And likewise, there's no question that the subsequent French Revolution was basically fomented, encouraged, and carried out by members of Freemasonry. But I think the one that really gets me, because I'm, like a lot of people, am fascinated and kind of a student of the American Civil War. Of course, in Texas, we still refer to it as the War of
Northern Aggression.
The War of Northern Aggression. But it's amazing because I never could understand what really brought men of goodwill and common sense and consideration to such a terrible tragedy. And without going into a long drawn-out thing, let me just tell you what Germany's Otto von Bismarck said. He said the division of the United States into federations of equal force was decided long before the Civil War by the high financial powers of Europe. These bankers were afraid that the United States, if they remained in one bloc and as one nation, would attain economic and financial independence and would upset their financial domination over the world. So in other words, this American Civil War, and I present ample examples of this, was the result of secret society agitation, the main culprit being something called the Knights of the Golden Circle, of which a documented member was none other than John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of President Lincoln.
And so were the other would-be assassins that night, the one that attempted to assassinate and indeed shot.
Right, who attacked Secretary of State Seward.
Yeah, and also the other conspirators that were alleged to have helped him along the way. Let me ask you, in that respect then, because this is interesting and not often discussed, that the theory was that at this point the United States was up and running, there was a lot of money to be made, and there was a lot of interest on the part of international banking houses. And again, this isn't an anti-Semitic plot by any means, because this was these are banking houses that represented a variety of denominations, and they were interested in seeing the United States get broken up. What better way to do it then, though, than to get the North pitted against the South, and then once that had taken place, then the plot was even further still to get the individual states to be fighting amongst themselves eventually.
Exactly, just like they had done with the European states for many, many, many years. And what's fascinating is that some of this we already know, we've just never put two and two together. If you go back, you realize that we threw the British out and became independent in 1776 or thereabout. But they weren't satisfied with that. They came back in 1812, and we fought another war. They burned Washington to the ground, and we barely threw them off that again. Well, at that point, history kind of leaves off. It's like, well, I guess they just accepted that we're independent, but it's not really true. They realized how strong we were and how difficult it was going to be to try to attack us or across the ocean. So they began to foment rebellion and revolution and trying to break up the United States. Midway through the Civil War, we find that the bulk of the British forces were in Canada. And we find, and where was the French army? It was in Mexico under Maximilian. And the whole game plan was to bleed the North and the South dry, fighting each other, and then they were going to move in and take over. And you know what? It's being a good Southern boy, I hate to say this, but it seems like Abraham Lincoln may have been the only guy that really figured all this out. Because let me give you a quote from his, that this is in 1862, which was almost halfway through the war. And of course, we're always taught that war was fought over slavery, but it's simply not true. In 1862, here's what Lincoln said: "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I'd also do that." So this idea about slavery being the main primary cause of the Civil War is simply not true. It was a plot of the secret societies.
Well, and I have to say that, as much as I enjoyed that reading immensely, also as a student of the Civil War, I think there are aspects of that which are underplayed slightly in that scenario, only because, although that is something that, of course, Lincoln did in fact say, it doesn't necessarily preclude that he was a true abolitionist, and we know of his writings and his speeches long before the Lincoln-Douglas debates, in which he was dedicated to the idea of the abolition of slavery, although, as you talk about, I think the economic forces at work perhaps bring us these odd types of coincidences, like we discussed last hour, where you have, anarchistic Gen X kids who appear to be the super patriots against the WTO, who are almost by accident in a position which others would think represents something else on observance. But Jim, there's so many...
But Ian, this is a common and ongoing methodology of the secret societies, which is to take popular issues, doesn't matter what it is, anything to generate discord and chaos so that they can move in and move along. This is why so many of the environmentalist movements are funded by some of the very same giant corporations that they are perceived to be opposed to.
And it's what makes Rule by Secrecy, the book by Jim Marrs, to be such a fascinating and fun read, and one that you really can't put down. One secret society to the next, one caller to the next, hanging on Coast to Coast AM. Let's start with Craig for author Jim Marrs. Craig?
Yes. Good morning to you and your guest.
Good morning.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Beautifully. Okay.
I have a couple questions about the Freemasons in their inception. Is it my understanding that they came from a group, a union of the stonemasons?
Well, yes, that's what's popularly alleged, but now who created the stonemason guilds? When you go back, you find out that it was the Knights Templar.
Yes, but wasn't the union designed, I guess, for its reasons to protect the trade secrets of the Masons themselves? The workers themselves formed a union.
Well, again, that is probably a faction, but the main purpose was that once these guilds had come into being, they weren't that powerful, but they realized that back during the Middle Ages, it was the stonemason guilds, which was one of the few organizations that was able to move freely from city to city and country to country, because when they would move in somewhere to build a big cathedral, they'd all gather from all points. And so this was one of the few groups that was able to move with impunity through different countries and from different places. And this was the way that they were able to spread their doctrines.
And Craig, I guess one way to look at it in a modern context is, if you have a company and you want to go public on Wall Street, you can do it one of two ways. You can have an IPO, you can, incorporate and offer your stock, or you can buy a company that is already being traded, and then you can consolidate your two organizations using that other company to now represent you on Wall Street. And that's kind of what the Knights Templar, in fact, it's sort of a pattern of secret societies in general, isn't it, Jim, that they can often take over a pre-existing organization that might have had a completely different orientation, or maybe even a similar orientation without the same motivation, and become something new and very different.
Absolutely, that's a wonderful example, Ian, and it's so true. They have throughout history have taken popular movements and popular organizations and businesses that have been successful, and then they move in, they buy them up, they infiltrate them, and one way or another they take them over.
And thank you, Craig, for your comment. Let's address the origin of Freemasonry in that sense, because a lot of people, I believe, get the catechismal answer, if you will, from the Freemasonry material, that this is an organization that has existed, in a similar capacity as it exists now, and goes all the way back to the building of the temple.
Solomon's temple, right? Or
yes
even
or no?
before that, actually.
Well, then go ahead and explain that so that people understand.
Well, writing many years ago, a Masonic author by the name of Walter Wilhelmshurst wrote that skilled scientific assistance from ancient gods and guardians were needed to bring the human race into a better and more progressive mode. And just to show that he wasn't speaking strictly allegorically, I'd like to quote from Manly P. Hall, a fairly well-known philosopher and a very high-ranking Mason. And he said that in the remote past, the gods walked with men, and they chose from among the sons of men the wisest and the truest. And these illuminated ones founded what we know as the ancient mysteries. And that was the Masons believed that that was the actual beginning. This knowledge that was passed along by these gods is what has been passed down through Masonry all through the centuries, even though it's made all kinds of twists and turns in its evolution and development.
Well, let's hold the subject of the ancient mysteries for next hour, because I'd love to end the show, if we could, this evening on that subject itself. I'd love for you to go into it in our last couple of segments on the ancient mysteries and what they were, and what we can put together now from the evidence that we have of just what it was that was so valuable to these organizations from the very beginning. What it was that gave the Knights Templar, for example, their rise to power, and what it is that some organizations might still be holding close to their vests in their inner circles of their secret societies. Rule by Secrecy, Jim Marrs, many people hanging on to talk to him and to ask their questions about the secret societies that they most suspect and the effect that they've had on human history, coming up next. My name's Ian Punnett, and this is Coast to Coast AM.
Lines are now open. From west of the Rockies, dial 1-800-618-8255. East of the Rockies, 1-800-825-5033.
And north of the national border line, hopping as well. We'll get to a bunch of calls from Canada coming up for Jim Marrs, author of Rule by Secrecy, the hidden history that connects the Trilateral Commission, the Freemasons, and the Great Pyramids. It is a primer for anybody that has ever wanted to take the steps into this largely unexplored territory of human history and current events. And I thank you, Jim Marrs, for the excellent read. Let's get David from Winnipeg with a question for Jim Marrs. Good morning, David.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
My question is Jim aware of an artist, a French artist by the name of Jean Cocteau, and a organization known as the Priory of Zion?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I have a whole section in my book, Rule by Secrecy, about the Priory of Zion.
My second question was, are you aware of the configuration of churches forming what I believe are a Maltese cross across the countries of France and England, I believe?
Well, actually, I think you may be referring to the Maltese Cross. It's in the Aegean Sea. It's in the Mediterranean. That was described by a former NASA official named Maurice Shaitlin, who said that these certain sacred sites and monasteries and stuff, if you could connect them all, you would find a perfect outline of a Maltese cross. But you could only do that if you could view it from space.
Definitely. Is there possibly any correlation between UFO visitors and possible information that the group of the Templars had acquired?
I think you may have read the tail end of my book, Rule by Secrecy.
Do you want to talk without talking about what the ancient and thank you, David. Do you want without giving away what the ancient mysteries are, and we'll save that for next hour. If you want to explore that a little bit about the possibility of who those gods were that you referenced before the bottom of the hour news.
Well, let me, I'll tell you what, hopefully this will lead into it, but let's start with Adolf Hitler and his Nazis, okay? That's something kind of in modern times that a lot of people know about, but what they don't know, and a lot of people have heard about the occult connections, okay? But they really don't know that much about it. In fact, it's interesting, one of the officials from Nuremberg said that they deliberately suppressed all this information about what the Nazis truly believed because it was so bizarre that they were afraid that these Nazis on trial at Nuremberg would try to mount some sort of insanity defense. So, yes, that was a tremendous thing there. What we don't understand about Hitler is that he didn't just kind of, rise to power. He was an army intelligence agent who was sent to take control of the Nazi Party, financed by the army, and basically put into power by a secret society called the Thule Society. Now, what did the Thule Society believe? Well, they believed that in man's prehistory, that gods from the sky came down, mated with human women, and created 7 races of men, the purest of which, the ones that was the closest in bloodline to these sky gods, were the Aryans. That's why Hitler and his Nazis had all this big thing about the Aryans. And if you think that sounds bizarre, science fiction-y, and totally out of the realm of any kind of rational thought, just go to the Bible and look in the book of Genesis and you find references to the Nephilim. Scholars agree that the translation and the information seems to be that the Nephilim were the offspring of the sons of God who came down to earth and mated with human women.
It is a fascinating subject in and of itself, closer to your other book, Alien Agenda. And I want to refer people for more information on that too, to your website, jimmars.com. And yet, let's also go back to that thought too of Jean Cocteau real fast. As David mentioned, is that the filmmaker Jean Cocteau? Because I don't know anything. I mean, I know you talk about the priori of Zion, but not of that in particular.
No, I don't think this is the filmmaker. I think this was a painter earlier in this century, and that gets into the very mysterious Priory of Zion. Not trying to get too far off the subject, would I be too far off base since you're mentioning the website to mention that I'm also right now, just now, coming out with the first full-length non-fiction book that is being put out on the internet as an electronic book. It's the first e-book from a best-selling author, and you can find details on that at alienzoo.com.
Cool.
Am I out of line on that?
No, I don't go. That's totally fine with me. And by the way, too, I believe the painter and the filmmaker are one and the same. I just never heard him mentioned in regard to the Priory of Zion. But if I can, there's something that you mentioned in the book, and at the very beginning of the show, I had said that, some of my earliest introductions to secret societies came in these sort of badly typed, carbon-copied letters that I would get from listeners when I was working at these small little music stations, and they were begging me to, investigate the Illuminati and other secret societies that they would mention. And they frequently, those same people would talk about the protocols of Zion. And I thought there was something that should be mentioned here because we had gone to great lengths earlier to try to disseminate some of this anti-Semitism from the discussions of these secret societies, that the Priory of Zion and these protocols of the Elders of Zion may be interrelated as well.
Absolutely. In fact, let me point out, this is really fascinating, the protocols of the Elders of Zion and actually were perverted in the early part of the 20th century into an anti-Semitic tirade by the Tsar's secret police in Russia, and they were trying to blame all of the rebellion that was going on against the Tsar on the Jews, okay? But it's simply not true. In fact, I'd heard about the protocols of the Elders of Zion for years and years and years, and couldn't find any place where I could find out really what that was all about. So I have a section in my book, Rule by Secrecy, about that. And what I found, and what's really fascinating, is that there are terms and descriptions and some things written in these protocols of Zion which clearly show that they were really not of Jewish origin, okay? And in fact, what it says in the original documents was that this was the Elders of Zion instead of Z-I-O-N, Zion, which of course refers to Jewish belief.